Ambulance driver hears a loud barking. The reason will stun you. It was a quiet afternoon in a small town, the kind where every sound feels amplified in the stillness. The hum of distant traffic was barely noticeable, just the occasional whoosh of a passing car. But everything else seemed muted. Inside, an ambulance parked near the side of a narrow street. It was a rare moment of calm. The driver, David, sat in the front seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared absent-mindedly at the rearview mirror. He had just finished his shift for the day, waiting for the next call, when the quiet was suddenly shattered by a loud, frantic barking. David's heart skipped a beat. The sound was so sharp and intense it seemed to come from nowhere, echoing through the otherwise silent street. He looked around, confused. No dogs were visible in sight. The barking continued, louder now, like it was getting closer. Right, outside the ambulance. It was almost as if it were coming from inside the vehicle itself. He furrowed his brow, puzzled and a bit unnerved. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the surroundings. David had been driving ambulances for years. He'd heard all kinds of things during his shifts: sirens, cries for help, the desperate pleas of those in pain. But never had he experienced something like this. It wasn't just the barking that startled him, but the urgency behind it. It sounded like a dog in distress, desperately trying to warn him of something. A chill crept down his spine as he realized that there was no visible dog anywhere in sight. With a mix of curiosity and a growing sense of unease, David stepped out of the ambulance, his boots crunching on the gravel as he moved toward the source of the noise. His eyes scanned the alley next to the vehicle, then down the street, but all he could see were empty sidewalks and closed shop doors. The barking grew louder, more frantic, echoing in his mind as if calling out to him, urging him to act. David paused for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Could it be a stray dog somewhere nearby? Maybe one trapped or in trouble? He glanced back at the ambulance, which seemed strangely still, almost like it was waiting for something. He felt a sudden tension in the air, as if everything had come to a halt. The dog's barking had stopped. Dead silence. He turned around quickly, his breath catching in his throat. And then, out of nowhere, he heard it again, this time much closer. So close, in fact, that he was certain it was coming from behind him. He spun around, his eyes darting across the street, but once again there was no dog in sight. David's instincts kicked in. He had to find out what was going on. This wasn't just a random noise. There was something more to this. Something hidden. What was the source of the barking, and why did it feel like it was trying to communicate with him? As he began to walk down the narrow street, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. What was it that he was about to uncover? What was the reason behind the mysterious barking that had startled him out of his calm? With each step, David couldn't shake the feeling that this would be no ordinary day, and the truth behind the barking would shock him in ways he never imagined. Now, David's journey is just beginning, and so is the mystery. Would you have investigated the sound if you were in David's shoes? Let me know your thoughts, and stay tuned for the next chapter, where the mystery deepens. Rising action. David's pulse quickened with each step, his shoes scraping against the pavement as he moved further down the empty street. The barking had stopped again, but the eerie silence that followed was even more unsettling. He felt a nagging sensation at the back of his mind, as if something unseen was watching him, waiting for him to discover it. He shook the thought away, forcing himself to stay focused. The ambulance was only a few feet away, parked in the shade of a large oak tree. He took a deep breath, glanced over his shoulder one last time, and then turned into an alley that ran parallel to the main road. The alley was narrow, and the walls on either side were covered in layers of graffiti. It had an abandoned feel to it, a place forgotten by time and people. As he moved deeper into the alley, the barking sounded again, sharp, insistent. It was almost as if it was coming from within the walls themselves. David's heart raced, and he paused for a moment, staring at the old brick buildings on either side. He didn't know what he expected to find, but his gut told him that something wasn't right. He took another step forward, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. As he reached the end of the alley, he spotted something unusual, a small wooden door, tucked away beneath a rusted fire escape. It was old, weathered, and barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. But what caught David's attention was the faint outline of a dog's paw print in the dirt right in front of the door. His eyes narrowed. The print was fresh, as if the dog had just passed through. Without thinking, he reached for the handle. It creaked in protest as he pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit room inside. The air was stale and heavy, filled with the smell of damp wood and earth. David squinted, his eyes adjusting to the low light, and what he saw next made his stomach churn. Lining the walls were cages, old, rusted cages. And inside there were dogs, dozens of them. They were all different breeds, but they had one thing in common. They were scared. Some were pacing back and forth, others were curled up in corners, whimpering softly. But the most disturbing part was the silence. Despite their obvious fear, there was no barking. David's breath caught in his throat as he stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the cages. The dogs seemed to be staring at him, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and terror. It was clear that they had been here for a long time, but why were they so quiet now? Suddenly, a soft whimper broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of scratching against metal. David turned sharply to see a small dog, a brown and white terrier, pawing desperately at the bars of its cage. The dog's eyes were wide with fear, and its body trembled. It barked once, twice, but the sound was weak, as though it had no strength. Left. David's heart ached as he approached the cage. He knelt down, his hand reaching through the bars, offering comfort to the terrified animal. The dog flinched at first, but then it slowly pressed its head against his hand, as if it had been waiting for someone to show it kindness. "What happened to you?" David whispered softly, his voice breaking. "Who did this to you before?" The dog could respond. There was a loud noise behind him, a door slamming shut. David's head snapped up, his senses on high alert. He turned around quickly, but no one was there. The room felt colder now, the air thick with tension. His heart was pounding in his chest as he stood up, backing away from the cages. It was then that he heard it again, the barking. This time, it wasn't coming from the cages. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the building. The sound was louder, more intense, as if the dog was calling out for help. David didn't hesitate. He ran toward the source of the barking, his footsteps quickening as he moved through the narrow hallways. The barking grew louder with each passing second, but it wasn't until he reached the end of the corridor that he saw it. There, in the corner of a dark room, was a single dog. It was a large black German shepherd, its fur matted and dirty, but its eyes gleamed with a fierce intelligence. The dog stood still, staring at David, its body tense, and then, just as suddenly as the barking had started, it stopped. The dog's gaze shifted to something behind David, and it let out a low growl. David spun around, his heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the emptiness of the abandoned building. His mind was racing now, piecing together the puzzle. The barking, the strange silence, the dogs in the cages. It was all connected. But what was the reason behind it? What was causing these dogs to react in such a way? David's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden voice, low and guttural, coming from behind him. "You shouldn't have come here." The word sent a chill down his spine. He turned around slowly, his eyes locking onto the shadowy figure standing. In the doorway, it was a man, tall, with a rough, weathered face. He was holding something in his hand, something that glinted in the dim light. The man stepped forward, and the dogs began to bark once more, their voices rising in unison, creating a deafening chorus. David's blood ran cold as the figure raised the object in his hand, revealing what it was: a collar. But not just any collar. This one was adorned with sharp metal spikes. David's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. Who was this man, and what had he done to the dogs? And why did the barking seem to come from nowhere, like some kind of warning? The answers were just out of reach, but one thing was certain: he had to get out of here before it was too late. As the man moved closer, the dogs' barking grew louder, their growls more menacing. David's heart hammered in his chest as he turned to run, but he wasn't sure if he was running away from the man or from something far more terrifying. Would you have stayed and confronted the figure, or would you have run as fast as you could? Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for the shocking revelation that's about to unfold. David's pulse raced as his footsteps echoed through the narrow hallways, each one taking him further away from the menacing figure and the growing chorus of barking dogs. He didn't know what he was running from, but something told him he was on the brink of uncovering a truth far darker than he could have imagined. The shadowy figure's voice, cold and ominous, still rang in his ears. "You shouldn't have. Come here." He reached the door of the building, his hand grasping the rusty doorknob in a desperate attempt to escape, but when he yanked it open, his breath caught in his throat. Standing on the other side wasn't the street he had left behind. It was a small courtyard, hidden deep within the building's labyrinth. The space was overgrown with weeds and cluttered with discarded items. The dogs were everywhere, but they were silent now, watching him intently with eyes that seemed to know more than they should. David stumbled forward, trying to make sense of this new, unfamiliar space. The air was thick with a sense of dread, but his instinct urged him to push through. His eyes scanned the courtyard, and that's when he saw it. A large, rusted cage in the center of the area, larger than the ones inside the building. And inside the cage was something that made David's blood run cold. It wasn't a dog, but a human. A man, his face gaunt and hollow, his clothes ragged and torn. He was kneeling on the ground, his hands shackled to the bars. His eyes were wide, with fear, and his mouth moved, though no words came out. It was clear that he had been here for a long time. And just as David realized the horror of what he was seeing, the man's eyes locked onto him with an intensity that felt almost desperate. David's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. The barking dogs, the strange silence, the sudden disappearance of the figure, everything was connected. The man in the cage was a victim, just like the dogs. But who was he? And why was he being kept here? Suddenly, a cold laugh broke through the air, and David turned sharply to see the figure from earlier emerging from the shadows. The man was grinning now, a sickening smile that sent chills down David's spine. "I see you figured it out," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You should have stayed away." David's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing as the man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving David's face. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he moved, as if he were savoring every moment of this encounter. "You're wondering why the dogs are barking, aren't you?" the man continued. "You think it's some kind of coincidence, that they're just trying to warn you? Well, you're wrong." David swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice shaky. The man's smile grew wider, and he took another step forward. "It's not just the dogs who are trapped here. It's me too. You see, all of them, every single one, was a part of my experiment. I made them this way." David's confusion deepened, and he took a step back, his mind struggling to process the words. "Experiment?" he repeated. The man nodded, his eyes glinting with a twisted satisfaction. "I've been studying the bond between humans and animals for years. I wanted to see just how far I could push the boundaries, just how much a dog or a human could endure before they broke. The barking, it's not random. It's a signal, a warning, and when they stop barking, that's when you know it's too late. David's stomach turned as the man's words sank in. An experiment. The dogs weren't just scared, they were conditioned. And the man in the cage, David realized, was the one who had been tormenting them all along. But the revelation didn't stop there. As the man stepped closer, David noticed something he hadn't before. The man's hands were trembling, his eyes darting nervously as if he feared something. The dogs, too, were restless again, their low growls growing louder, their eyes trained on the man. It was clear that they knew him, knew what he had done, and they were waiting for the right moment. David took a deep breath, realizing that the truth was even more twisted than he had imagined. This wasn't just about one man's cruel experiment. It was about something deeper. The dogs weren't just trying to warn him, they were trying to protect him. Suddenly, the German shepherd from earlier sprang forward, its body launching toward the man in the cage. The dogs, now unified in their anger, began barking furiously as they surrounded him. David's heart raced as he realized what was happening. These dogs weren't just trapped animals, they were the ones with the power to end the torment. They were about to take action. The man backed away, his expression shifting from confidence to fear. "No, no!" he shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "You can't—" But it was too late. The dogs, led by the German shepherd, lunged at him, their teeth bared, their claws scratching at the ground. In a matter of seconds, the man was overwhelmed, his cries drowned out by the barking and growling of the pack. David stood frozen in place, his mind racing with disbelief at the turn of events. The dogs had taken control. They had finally broken free from the man's grip, but the mystery of the barking, of what had brought him here, was far from over. As the last of the dogs subdued the man, David rushed to the cage where the man had been trapped. The prisoner inside, the one who had been held captive for so long, was now free. But he didn't seem to know what to do. His eyes were wide, his body shaking with fear. He had been through something unimaginable. David reached out to him, his voice soft and reassuring. "You're safe now. We'll get you out of here." But the man didn't respond. He simply stared at David with hollow eyes, as if he were lost, completely and utterly lost in the nightmare he had endured. As the last of the dogs stopped barking and settled down, David's heart pounded in his chest. He had just uncovered the twisted reality behind the mysterious barking, but one question still lingered in his mind. What would happen to these dogs now that they had been freed? What do you think happened to the dogs after their rescue? Would you have made the same choices David did? Share your thoughts and stay tuned for the heartwarming resolution where the true bond between man and animal is tested. David stood there, surrounded by the now quiet dogs and the shaken man who had been imprisoned for so long. The tension in the air was thick, but the barking had ceased. The courtyard was still, save for the sound of David's own breathing and the occasional rustle of wind through the overgrown weeds. The dogs, their fur matted with dirt and their eyes filled with intelligence beyond what David had ever imagined, circled around the man cautiously. They no longer looked like wild animals, but like protectors, survivors of something far more horrific than anyone could have understood. David knelt down, his hands trembling as he tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. The sight of the dogs, once feral and seemingly threatening, now acting with purpose and loyalty, filled him with awe. He had witnessed something extraordinary, a bond so deep between the animals and the man they had rescued, it was almost spiritual. These animals weren't just responding out of instinct. They were responding to something much deeper, something David could only begin to comprehend. He looked up at the man, who had remained still and silent. His eyes were filled with a mix of gratitude and confusion. The ordeal he had endured was etched in every line of his face, but there was a glimmer of hope now. David reached out, offering his hand to the man, knowing that it was the first step toward healing, not just for the man, but for the dogs too. "Can you speak?" David asked softly. The man's eyes flickered to David's hand, and for a moment it seemed like he might retreat, lost in his own world of fear and trauma, but then slowly he nodded. His voice, when it came, was raspy, as if he hadn't used it in years. "Thank you," he whispered. I never thought I'd see the light again." David's heart clenched at the sound of the man's voice, so fragile and filled with years of suffering. The dogs, sensing the change in the atmosphere, slowly began to relax, their tails wagging gently as they neared the man. It was as if they had recognized that the ordeal was over, that they were finally safe. For a long while, David and the man didn't speak. They just sat in silence, the man surrounded by the loyal dogs who had saved him, and David, who had witnessed a bond that transcended anything he could have imagined. The dogs, once fierce and wild, had become the guardians they were always meant to be, and the man, though broken, was now free. The night passed in quiet reflection, the storm outside having subsided. The air felt lighter, as though the darkness had lifted, replaced by the soft glow of the early morning light that began to seep through the cracks in the courtyard walls. David rose to his feet, brushing the dirt from his clothes. "We need to get you out of here," he said, his voice firm but gentle. The man nodded, rising to his feet with the help of the dogs, who nudged him gently, as if offering their support. As they made their way out of the courtyard, the dogs led the way, their steps purposeful and steady. David had no idea what had driven the man to such extreme measures, but he knew one thing for sure. The bond between him and these dogs was real. They had saved him, but in return they had found something even more precious: freedom. They reached the edge of the property, and David could see the faint outline of the ambulance in the distance, the first step toward getting both the man and the dogs the care they desperately needed. As the man turned to look back at the courtyard, his eyes filled with emotion, he placed a hand on the head of the German shepherd who had led the charge to free him. The dog's eyes locked with his, as if understanding the depth of the connection they had forged. David turned to the man, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and wonder. "You're safe now," he said softly, but the man didn't need any more words. His eyes, full of gratitude and something deeper, something that spoke of a bond formed through shared suffering, said it all. As the man climbed into the ambulance, followed by the dogs who now seemed to be his constant companions, David's heart felt lighter than it had in days. He had come here to investigate a mysterious sound, a series of strange barks that led him into an unimaginable journey. But in the end, it wasn't just about solving the mystery. It was about witnessing the incredible strength of the bond between man and animal. David turned away from the scene, walking toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to rise. There was something deeply reassuring about knowing that, in this world full of chaos, there were still moments of profound connection, where the unspoken understanding between a human and a dog could change the course of a life forever. Before he stepped into the ambulance, he looked over at the dogs one last time. They were calm now, their loyalty unwavering. He wondered, as he often did, if anyone would ever truly understand what had happened here. Perhaps not. But what mattered was that the truth had been revealed, and in that truth there was hope. David glanced back at the man who now had a second chance at life, the dogs by his side, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a beginning. A new chapter for both the man and the animals who had become his family. And as the ambulance pulled away, David knew that, despite the darkness that had surrounded them, the light was finally shining through. What do you think of the ending? Do you believe in the power of animals to change lives in such profound ways? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more emotional stories like this one.